Her husband was 4 months in the ground. She was 19 years old, and every man in the settlement had already decided she would not make it through the winter. What Anya Ericson did next, alone, with a dull pickaxe and a dead woman's journal, is something the town never forgot. The pickaxe came down wrong. Anya felt it in her wrists before she heard it. That jarring, bone-deep crack when cold steel meets frozen ground and the earth refuses to give. She yanked the tool back, reset her feet in the gray dirt, and swung again. The impact shuddered up through her forearms, her shoulders, into the base of her skull. The frost had already pushed 2 inches deeper overnight. She could tell by the way the top layer crumbled pale and dry, while everything beneath it locked hard as iron. She had maybe 3 weeks before the high passes closed. Maybe less. It was October in the valley above Bitter Creek, in the mountain country of what the surveyors had started calling the Northern Territories, a place where summer lasted 11 weeks, if God was generous, and winter arrived not like a season, but like a verdict. The peaks above the settlement of Providence were already capped in white to their shoulders. The aspens had bled out their gold 2 weeks early. The old Crow trapper who worked the ridgeline had ridden through 6 days ago without stopping, which the settlers of Providence took as a poor sign. Men who live outdoors do not hurry without reason. Anya Ericson was 19 years old, a widow 4 months out, and she was digging a hole in front of her cabin door. Not a grave. Something harder to explain to people who had never thought much about cold. She drove the pickaxe down again. A chunk of clay the size of a man's fist broke free, and she kicked it aside. Her hands inside Lars's old work gloves, stiff leather, one thumb repaired with a strip of rawhide, were already raw at the knuckles. The blisters from the first 2 days had torn open and dried into a second skin. She did not stop to examine them. She reset her feet and swung. The trench was 4 feet wide and roughly 8 feet long, running straight out from her front door into the cold air. She was working to drop it another foot deeper before nightfall. That was the plan her grandmother had drawn in a journal 50 years ago and half a world away, in a stone-floored house north of the Arctic Circle in Norway, where the snow could bury a rooftop in a single night, and the men who did not understand cold did not survive long enough to learn. The plan called for a covered tunnel, stone-lined, sloping down from the cabin door before rising back to a small outer entrance at ground level. The physics were simple. Cold air is heavier than warm. It sinks. It pools at the lowest point and stays there, sluggish and still, a plug of dense frozen air that blocks the wind from ever reaching the cabin door. Anya had read that passage 4 times by lamplight before she understood it fully. Then she had gone outside and started digging. The town had opinions about this. 2 days prior, Elias Croft, the Providence Land Company's agent, a man with the face of someone perpetually calculating what things were worth, had ridden out to her claim with Alistair Blackwood beside him. Blackwood was the settlement's builder, its authority on construction, a thick-necked man in his 50s who had put up cabins from the Ohio River country to the edge of the Rockies and considered that experience a form of scripture. He sat his horse the way men sit when they expect to be listened to. Croft had done the talking. The company, he explained, had a provision. Dwellings deemed unfit to withstand a hard winter could be reclaimed. Her cabin, north-facing door, built against the shadow of the hill away from the sun, had been assessed as untenable. She was being offered a room at the boarding house in exchange for work. In the spring, her situation would be reassessed. Reassessed. Anya knew what that word cost. She told them she would remain. Blackwood had looked at her the way a man looks at a cracked wagon axle, not with contempt exactly, but with the flat professional certainty of someone who has seen this particular failure before. "You will bury yourself," he said. He was not threatening her. He genuinely believed it, and that was worse. They rode back toward town, and Anya stood in the doorway of the cabin Lars had built, the cabin everyone in Providence agreed was a monument to poor judgment, and she watched them go. Then she went inside, opened the wooden chest her mother had brought from the old country, and pulled out her grandmother Ingrid's journal. She had read it before at Source as a child for the stories. She read it now for the instructions. That night the temperature dropped hard. She sat wrapped in a quilt with the journal open on the table, her breath making small white plumes in the lantern light, and she read about cold as a river you do not dam, but redirect. She read about wind as a wolf you do not face in an open field. She read her grandmother's precise, unhurried descriptions of the entrance tunnel, the snowgang, Ingrid called it, and the stone lining, and the log and earth roof, and the low outer door no bigger than a dog had to crawl through. She studied the diagram drawn in a careful hand, the slope down, the flat bottom, the slope back up, the cold pooling at the lowest point, the warm air rising, held inside. A trap, a channel, an arrangement with the cold rather than a war against it. Lars had built this cabin against the hill for a reason. He had not known the science. He had felt it. The hill would catch the drifting snow from the north and pile it high, exactly where a tunnel needed covering, exactly where insulation needed to be, deep. He had been right without the words to say why, and the men who had the words had not been right at all. She closed the journal. Outside, the wind moved through the pines on the ridge with a low, steady moan. She started digging the next morning before the light was full. Now, on the fourth day, with the trench cut deep and her arms heavy as wet rope, Anya stopped to look at what she had made. The opening was rough and smelled of raw earth and stone dust. The walls were not pretty. The flat rocks she had dragged down from the hillside on Lars's logging sledge were mortared with nothing but their own weight and the clay she had packed between them. It would hold. She knew it would hold the same way she knew how to read a sky or judge a fire, not from a book, but from a body that had grown up in cold country. She drove the shovel in again. Up at the south end of the settlement, smoke was rising from every chimney in straight white columns. The sky above the peaks had turned the color of old pewter. That morning, a stillness had moved into the valley that had no sound inside it. The birds had gone quiet. The creek had stopped its usual noise, not frozen yet, but thickened, moving slow under a skin of shelf ice along the banks. The old crow trapper had called that kind of sky a breeder, pregnant with something massive. Anya looked up at it once. Then she picked up the axe and went to work on the timber she needed to roof the tunnel before the storm arrived. She did not have much time. The aspen logs came down hard. Anya had felled 11 of them from the thicket above the cabin, working the axe in short, controlled strokes the way Lars had shown her. Notch on the fall side first, then the back cut, then step clear and let the tree decide. She was not fast, but she was accurate. Each trunk hit the frozen ground with a crack that echoed off the hillside, and she limbed them where they fell, kicking the branches clear with her boot heel before dragging the poles down the slope one at a time. The sledge helped. Barely. One of its runners had a warp in it from the summer, and it tracked sideways under a load, pulling hard to the left. She had lashed a short length of rawhide around the front to use as a steering line, hauling the pole load with her left hand and correcting the runner drift with her right. Her shoulders burned. The frozen ground gave the sledge nothing to slide on. It dragged more than it rode, scraping over rock and root and bare earth with a grinding resistance that ate through her strength 1 yard at a time. She laid the logs across the stone walls of the trench, fitting them tight. No nails. She did not have enough, and her grandmother's journal had not called for them anyway. Weight and fit would hold it. She packed clay from the trench bottom into the gaps between the logs, pressing it in with her thumb, and over the whole roof she layered pine boughs 3 hands deep before she began shoveling the excavated earth back on top. Shovelful by shovelful, the tunnel disappeared. What remained when she finished was a low mound of raw earth running out from her doorway, with a small, dark opening at its far end, a hole roughly the size of a crate lid, just above ground level. She fashioned a door for it from broken plank boards, hung it on 2 strips of leather, and fitted a simple wooden peg as a latch. It was not a door a man would be proud of. It looked like something an animal had scratched out of the hillside. That was close enough to what it was. She crawled through it to test the fit. The wind cut off the instant she pulled the little door shut behind her. Not faded. Cut off. The tunnel swallowed the sound of the storm building above the peaks and returned nothing but a deep, packed silence. The air inside was cold, but motionless. And motionless cold is a different thing entirely from wind-driven cold. Wind pulls heat from a body the way a draw pulls water, fast, constant, and without mercy. Still, air holds around you. She could feel it already, the absence of drain. She crawled the 12 feet to her cabin door and pushed it open. The stove had been burning low while she worked. The cabin held at a temperature she could feel on her face. Not warm, not yet, but not the raw, gnawing cold of the outside either. The air was dry. Still, the floor showed no frost creep at the threshold. She had not noticed that before, because before there had always been a draft under the door, that thin, constant bleed of warmth that a frontier stove fights all winter and usually loses. The draft was gone. She fed the stove 2 splits of pine and a length of cottonwood, and watched the temperature climb in a way it never had before. The heat had nowhere to run. That was the afternoon before the sky broke. Mistress Croft had come that morning with 2 other women and a basket. They stood at the edge of the earthen mound and looked at the small, dark opening with the expression people use when they cannot decide whether to feel pity or alarm. Anya had tried to explain the cold sink, the way heavy, frigid air pools at the tunnel's low point and plugs the passage the way a cork plugs a bottle. The women nodded in the manner of people being polite to someone they believe is not well. One of them touched Anya's arm gently before they left, a gesture that said more than words. Blackwood had come in the afternoon, alone. He stood over the mound with his arms crossed and told her she was channeling meltwater to her sill logs. He told her the frost heave would crack her foundation by March. He told her that in 30 years of building in hard country, he had never once seen a sunken entrance that did not become a block of ice by January, trapping the occupant inside. His voice carried the particular weight of a man who has been right so many times that being right has become the same thing as breathing. Anya kept packing clay into the log joints while he talked. She told him the site sloped away from the cabin. She told him the drainage channel her grandmother had specified was already cut along the south wall of the trench. She did not tell him that her hands were shaking inside the gloves, not from cold, but from the effort of holding her voice steady against 30 years of his certainty, pressing down on her like a boot heel. He left. She went back to work. The sky that evening turned the color of a tallow candle, yellow-white and opaque. The clouds dropping so low, the upper ridgeline vanished entirely. The air stopped moving. That was the thing she noticed most, the complete cessation of the wind, that last held breath before a storm of real size arrives. The creek below the property made no sound. A single raven flew north over the cabin without calling, moving fast and low. Anya brought in the last of the cut wood, stacking it inside the tunnel walls where it would stay dry. She pulled the outer door shut, latched it, walked to her main door, and latched that, too. She lit the tallow candle on the table, set a pot of water on the stove, and opened her grandmother's journal to a page she had already read 6 times. The storm does not care what you believe about it. It only cares what you have built. She closed the journal and set it on the table within reach, the way you set something down that you may need again before morning. Outside, the first hard pellets of ice began to hit the roof. The blizzard did not build. It arrived whole. By the time full dark fell over Providence, the wind had reached the kind of force that stops being a sound and becomes a pressure, a solid, continuous weight against every wall, every joint, every gap in a structure. It did not gust. It leaned. The snow it carried was not the soft, heavy flakes of a normal mountain storm. It was fine and sharp, driven nearly horizontal, and it found every weakness in every cabin in the settlement the way water finds a crack in stone. Inside those cabins, the south-facing doors, Blackwood's great emblem of defiance, were taking the full force of the blow. The wind hammered the frames. It drove snow through gaps no wider than a knife blade, dusting the floorboards white. The grand porches Blackwood had built to catch the winter sun now acted as collection traps, and the drifts piling against the south walls climbed fast, to the windowsills by midnight, to the eaves before dawn. Iron stoves ran wide open, and still the cold pressed in. Families burned through a week's wood in 12 hours. Children were pulled from beds and wrapped in every quilt a household owned, their breath clouding in rooms that should have been warm. Blackwood's own showcase cabin went cold on the 3rd day. His wife Mary called down from the loft that the children were shivering and would not stop. He threw the second-to-last split of pine into the stove and looked at the window, which was plastered over solid with packed snow and ice, a white wall where glass had been. The door could not be opened. The drift on the south side had buried it to the top of the frame. They were sealed in, not by the cabin, but by the design of it, by the porch that had caught the snow, by the door that faced the storm's full mouth. He sat in the near dark and felt something he had not felt in 30 years of building. He felt wrong. On the morning of the 4th day, the wind dropped just enough. He made the decision quickly, because thinking about it longer would not have made it easier. He pulled 2 neighbors through a 2nd-story window on the sheltered side of the house. They dropped into snow, chest deep, gasping at the cold, and stood for a moment looking at a valley that no longer existed. There were no cabins, no fences, no road. There was only a vast, sculpted white silence broken by a few stovepipes trailing thin smoke, the last signs of life in a buried town. They moved toward Anya's claim because Blackwood had told himself they were looking for salvage. Wood. Supplies from an abandoned structure. He believed, with the flat certainty of a man who has made too many accurate predictions, that the cabin would be gone, collapsed under the drift, or simply empty, the girl having fled or frozen in the first night. What he found instead was a hole in the snow. Small, dark, rectangular, cut into the base of a massive drift at the foot of the hill. From it, came a faint shimmer of rising heat, and carried on that heat, the smell of wood smoke and something else, something that stopped all three men where they stood in the knee-deep snow. It was the smell of bread. Fresh bread, hot from a pan, impossible, and warm in the killing cold. Blackwood dropped to his knees and crawled in. The wind stopped. Between one heartbeat and the next, the screaming outside became nothing. The tunnel held 12 feet of stone-walled silence, and the air inside, while cold, was still. The pooled, plugged air of a cold sink doing exactly what Ingrid had written it would do 50 years ago in a journal no one in Providence had thought worth reading. He crawled to the end, pushed himself upright, and opened the cabin door. Anya looked up from her chair. She was knitting. The stove threw a steady, even heat. The kettle moved softly on its surface. The floor was dry. The walls showed no frost. The air smelled of pine and stew and tallow, and it was warm, not the desperate, over-fired warmth of a stove running on its last log, but the settled, accumulated warmth of a space that had not bled heat for 4 days. She was not surviving. She was simply living. Blackwood stood in the doorway with ice in his beard and looked at the woman he had called a fool, whose land he had moved to strip, whose cabin he had called a tomb. He had nothing to say that was worth saying. She looked at the three men, their faces gray and cracked with cold, their hands shaking, and she stood up, took 3 bowls from the shelf, and filled them from the pot on the stove. "Eat," she said. "You must be cold." They ate. Over the next hours, Blackwood made the trip back through the storm 4 more times, leading families through the blizzard to the small, dark opening in the snow. 15 people packed into a cabin built for one. Children slept on the floor under shared quilts, warm for the first time in days. The stove, fed with economy and respect, held the heat easily. There was enough wood. There was enough food. There was enough because the cabin had not wasted a single degree of warmth since the storm began. On the 5th day, the storm broke. That evening, Blackwood sat on a low stool with a tin cup of warm cider and watched Anya move through the small space, checking the stove, rationing the remaining flour, showing one of the other women how little wood was needed when a room held its heat properly. He watched for a long time before he spoke. "I was wrong," he said, loud enough for the room to hear it. "We would have died in those cabins, in my cabins." He stopped, started again. "You were right. How did you know?" Anya did not remind him of what he had said to her. She did not list the insults or recall the prophecy he had made about her grave. She walked to the wooden chest, took out the leather-bound journal, and set it in his hands. "My grandmother knew," she said. He held it the way a man holds something he has no framework to understand, carefully, with both hands, the way you hold a tool you have never seen before, but can tell was made by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Spring came slow that year. When the passes finally cleared and the mud dried, and the town of Providence shook the last of the winter off its bones, the first thing they built was not a new cabin. It was a tunnel. Then another. Then another. By the following October, every structure in the settlement had one. Stone-lined, log-roofed, low-doored, dug into the earth with the patient humility of people who had learned the hard way what the cold does to pride. They called them Anya's tunnels. Blackwood built his own with his own hands, without asking for help, which was the most honest thing he ever did. If this story of a young woman who listened when no one else would moved you, like this video, subscribe to Wild West Survival Tales for more forgotten frontier stories every week. And share this with someone who needs to be reminded that the quietest person in the room is sometimes the only one who knows what's coming.